Common sense is a basic ability to perceive, understand, and judge things, which is shared by nearly all people and can reasonably be expected of nearly all people without any need for debate. The everyday understanding of what common sense is derived from philosophical discussion, involving several European languages. Related terms in other languages include Latin sensus communis, Greek kappa omicron iota nu alpha sigma theta eta sigma iota sigma, and French bon sen. But these are not straightforward translations in all contexts. Similarly, in English, there are different shades of meaning, implying more or less education and wisdom. Good sense is sometimes seen as equivalent to common sense, and sometimes not. Common sense has at least two specifically philosophical meanings. One is a capability of the animal soul proposed by Aristotle, which enables different individual senses to collectively perceive the characteristics of physical things such as movement and size, which all physical things have in different combinations, allowing people and other animals to distinguish and identify physical things. This common sense is distinct from basic sensory perception and from human rational thinking, but cooperates with both. The second special use of the term is Roman-influenced and is used for the natural human sensitivity for other humans and the community, just like the everyday meaning. Both of these refer to a type of basic awareness and ability to judge which most people are expected to share naturally, even if they cannot explain why. All these meanings of common sense, including the everyday one, are interconnected in a complex history and have evolved during important political and philosophical debates in modern Western civilization, notably concerning science, politics, and economics. The interplay between the meanings has come to be particularly notable in English, as opposed to other Western European languages, and the English term has become international. In modern times, the term common sense has frequently been used for rhetorical effect, sometimes pejorative, and sometimes appealed to positively. As an authority, it can be negatively equated to vulgar prejudice and superstition, or on the contrary, it is often positively contrasted to them as a standard for good taste and as the source of the most basic axioms needed for science and logic. This began with Descartes' criticism of it, and what came to be known as the dispute between rationalism and empiricism. In the opening line of one of his most famous books, Discourse on Method, Descartes established the most common modern meaning, and its controversies, when he stated that everyone has a similar and sufficient amount of common sense, but it is rarely used well. Therefore, a skeptical logical method described by Descartes needs to be followed and common sense should not be overly relied upon. In the ensuing 18th century Enlightenment, common sense came to be seen more positively as the basis for modern thinking. It was contrasted to metaphysics, which was, like Cartesianism, associated with the ancient regime. Thomas Paine's polemical pamphlet Common Sense has been described as the most influential political pamphlet of the 18th century, affecting both the American and French revolutions. Today, the concept of common sense, and how it should best be used, remains linked to many of the most perennial topics in epistemology and ethics, with special focus often directed at the philosophy of the modern social sciences. Aristotelian common sense. The origin of the term is in the works of Aristotle. The most well-known such case is De Anima Book 3, Chapter 2, especially at line 425a-27. The passage is about how the animal mind converts raw sense perceptions from the 5 specialized sense perceptions into perceptions of real things moving and changing, which can be thought about. According to Aristotle's understanding of perception, each of the 5 senses perceives one type of perceptible, or sensible, which is specific to it. For example, sight can see color. But Aristotle was explaining how the animal mind, not just the human mind, links and categorizes different tastes, colors, feelings, smells and sounds in order to perceive real things in terms of the common sensibles. In this discussion, common is a term opposed to specific or particular. The Greek for these common sensibles is ta koina, which means shared or common things, and examples include the oneness of each thing, with its specific shape and size and so on, and the change or movement of each thing. Distinct combinations of these properties are common to all perceived things. In this passage, Aristotle explained that concerning these koina we already have a sense, a common sense, or sense of the common things, which does not work by accident, and there is no specific sense perception for movement another koina, because then we would not perceive the koina at all, except by accident. As examples of perceiving by accident, Aristotle mentions using the specific sense perception vision on its own to see that something is sweet, or to recognize a friend by their distinctive color. Lee explains that, when I see Socrates, it is not insofar as he is Socrates that he is visible to my eye, but rather because he is colored. So the normal 5 individual senses do sense the common perceptibles according to Aristotle, but it is not something they necessarily interpret correctly on their own. Aristotle proposes that the reason for having several senses is in fact that it increases the chances that we can distinguish and recognize things correctly, and not just occasionally or by accident. Each sense is used to identify distinctions, such as sight identifying the difference between black and white, but, says Aristotle, all animals with perception must have some one thing which can distinguish black from sweet. The common sense is where this comparison happens, and this must occur by comparing impressions of what the specialist senses have perceived. The common sense is therefore also where a type of consciousness originates, for it makes us aware of having sensations at all, and it receives physical picture imprints from the imaginative faculty, which are then memories that can be recollected. The discussion was apparently intended to improve upon the account of Aristotle's friend and teacher Plato in his Socratic dialogue, the Theaetetus. But Plato's dialogue presented an argument that recognizing koina as an active thinking process which happens in the rational part of the human soul, making the senses instruments of the thinking part of man. Plato's Socrates says this kind of thinking is not a kind of sense at all. Aristotle, trying to give a more general account of the souls of all animals, not just humans, moved the act of perception out of the rational thinking soul into this sensus communis, which is something like a sense, and something like thinking, but not rational. The passage is difficult to interpret and there is little consensus about many of the details. Gregory has argued that this may be because Aristotle did not use the term as a standardized technical term at all. For example, in some passages in his works, there is also difficulty with trying to determine whether the common sense is truly separable from the individual sense perceptions and from imagination, in anything other than a conceptual way as a capability. Aristotle never fully spells out the relationship between the common sense and the imaginative faculty, although the two clearly work together in animals, and not only humans. For example, in order to enable a perception of time, they may even be the same. Despite hints by Aristotle himself that they were united, early commentators such as Alexander of Aphrodisias and Al-Farabi felt they were distinct. But later, Avicenna emphasized the link, influencing future authors including Christian philosophers. Gregory argues that Aristotle used the term common sense both to discuss the individual senses when these act as a unity, which Gregory calls the perceptual capacity of the soul, or the higher-level sensory capacity of the soul, which represents the senses and the imagination working as a unity. According to Gregory, there appears to have been a standardization of the term coined eithesis as a term for the perceptual capacity which occurred by the time of Alexander of Aphrodisias at the latest. Aristotle's understanding of the soul has an extra level of complexity in the form of the nous or intellect, which is something only humans have, and which enables humans to perceive things in a different way to other animals. It works with images coming from the common sense and imagination, using reasoning as well as the active intellect. It is the nous which identifies the true forms of things, while the common sense identifies shared aspects of things. Although scholars have varying interpretations of the details, Aristotle's common sense was in any case not rational, in the sense that it implied no ability to explain the perception. Reason or rationality exists only in man according to Aristotle, and yet some animals can perceive common perceptibles, such as change and shape, and some even have imagination according to Aristotle. Animals with imagination come closest to having something like reasoning and nous. Plato, on the other hand, was apparently willing to allow that animals could have some level of thought, meaning that he did not have to explain their sometimes complex behavior with a strict division between high-level perception processing and the human-like thinking, such as being able to form opinions. Gregory additionally argues that Aristotle can be interpreted as using the verbs phronein and nein to distinguish two types of thinking or awareness, one being found in animals, and the other unique to humans and involving reason. Therefore, in Aristotle, the universals which are used in identifying and categorizing things are divided into two. In medieval terminology, these are the species sensibilis, which are used for perception and imagination in animals, and the species intelligibilis or apprehendable forms used in the human intellect or nous. Aristotle also occasionally called the koinethesis, the proton aesthetikon, the first of the senses. Later philosophers developing this line of thought, such as Themistius, Galen, and Al-Farabi, called it the ruler of the senses or ruling sense, apparently a metaphor developed from a section of Plato's Timaeus. Augustine and some of the Arab writers also called it the inner sense. The concept of the inner senses, plural, was further developed in the Middle Ages. Under the influence of the great Persian philosophers Al-Farabi and Avicenna, several inner senses came to be listed. Thomas Aquinas and John of Jandun recognized four internal senses: the common sense, imagination, vis cogitativa, and memory. Avicenna, followed by Robert Grosseteste, Albert the Great, and Roger Bacon, argued for five internal senses: the common sense, imagination, fantasy, vis estimativa, and memory. By the time of Descartes and Hobbes, in the 1600s, the inner senses had been standardized to 5 wits, which complemented the more well-known 5 external senses. Under this medieval scheme, the common sense was understood to be seated not in the heart, as Aristotle had thought, but in the anterior galenic ventricle of the brain. The great anatomist Andreas Vesalius, however, found no connections between the anterior ventricle and the sensory nerves, leading to speculation about other parts of the brain into the 1600s. Hella Roazan writes that, in different ways, the philosophers of medieval Latin and Arabic tradition, from Al-Farabi to Avicenna, Averroes, Albert, and Thomas, found in the Dharma and the Parva naturally are the scattered elements of a coherent doctrine of the central faculty of the sensuous soul. It was one of the most successful and resilient of Aristotelian notions. Roman common sense, sensus communis, is the Latin translation of Aquinas' thesis, which came to be recovered by medieval scholastics when discussing Aristotelian theories of perception. However, in earlier Latin during the Roman Empire, the term had taken a distinct ethical detour, developing new shades of meaning. These especially Roman meanings were apparently influenced by several Stoic Greek terms, with the word koine not only coined I thesis, but also such terms as koinous, koinonia, and koinonimusuna, all of which involve nous, something which at least in Aristotle would not be present in lower animals. Koinenoi is a term from Stoic philosophy, a Greek philosophy, influenced by Aristotle, and influential in Rome. This refers to shared notions, or common conceptions, that are either inborn or imprinted by the senses onto the soul. Unfortunately, few true Stoic texts survive, and our understanding of their technical terminology is limited. Koinos nous is a term found in Epictetus, a Stoic philosopher. C.S. Lewis believed this to be close to a modern English meaning of common sense, the elementary mental outfit of the normal man, something like intelligence. He noted that sensus could be a translation of nous, but he only found one clear case of a Latin text showing this apparent meaning, a text by Phaedrus the fable writer. Kononymus una is found only in the work of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, also known as a Stoic. Shaftesbury and others felt it represented the Stoic Greek original, which gave the special Roman meaning of sensus communis, especially when used to refer to someone's public spirit. Shaftesbury explained the change of meaning as being due to the specific way that Stoics understood perception and intellect, saying that one should consider withal how small the distinction was in that philosophy, between the pi-omicron lambda eta iota sigma conjecture, and the vulgar alpha sigma theta eta sigma iota sigma perception, how generally passion was by those philosophers brought under the head of opinion. Another link between Latin communis sensus and Aristotle's Greek was in rhetoric, a subject that Aristotle was the first to systematize. In rhetoric, a prudent speaker must take account of the opinions which are widely held. Aristotle referred to such commonly held beliefs not as konidoxy, which is a term he used for self-evident logical axioms, but with other terms such as endoxa. In his rhetoric, for example, Aristotle mentions koinon, tas pistis, or common beliefs, saying that our proofs and arguments must rest on generally accepted principles. When speaking of converse with the multitude, in a similar passage in his own work on rhetoric, De Orata, Cicero wrote that, in oratory the very cardinal sin is to depart from the language of everyday life and the usage approved by the sense of the community. The sense of the community is in this case one translation of communis sensus, in the Latin of Cicero. Whether the Latin writers such as Cicero deliberately use this Aristotelian term in a new, more peculiarly Roman way, probably also influenced by Greek Stoicism, therefore remains a subject of discussion. Schaeffer has proposed, for example, that the Roman Republic maintained a very oral culture, whereas in Aristotle's time rhetoric had come under heavy criticism from philosophers such as Socrates. Peters Agnew argues, in agreement with Shaftesbury in the 18th century, that the concept developed from the Stoic concept of ethical virtue, influenced by Aristotle, but emphasizing the role of both the individual perception and shared communal understanding. But in any case, a complex of ideas attached itself to the term, to be almost forgotten in the Middle Ages, and eventually returning into ethical discussion in 18th-century Europe, after Descartes. As with other meanings of common sense, for the Romans of the classical era, it designates a sensibility shared by all, from which one may deduce a number of fundamental judgments, that need not, or cannot, be questioned by rational reflection. But even though Cicero did at least once use the term in a manuscript on Plato's Timaeus, he and other Roman authors did not normally use it as a technical term limited to discussion about sense perception, as Aristotle apparently had in De Anima, and as the scholastics later would in the Middle Ages. Instead of referring to all animal judgment, it was used to describe pre-rational human beliefs which are widely shared, and therefore it was a near equivalent to the concept of humanitas. This was a term that could be used by Romans to imply not only human nature, but also humane conduct, good breeding, refined manners, and so on. Apart from Cicero, Quintilian, Lucretius, Seneca, Horace and some of the most influential Roman authors influenced by Aristotle's rhetoric and philosophy used the Latin term sensus communis in a range of such ways. As a C.S. Lewis wrote, Quintilian says it is better to send a boy to school than to have a private tutor for him at home, for if he is kept away from the herd, how will he ever learn that sensus which we call communis? On the lowest level it means tact. In Horace, the man who talks to you when you obviously don't want to talk lacks communis sensus, compared to Aristotle and his strictest medieval followers. These Roman authors were not so strict about the boundary between animal-like common sense and specially human reasoning. As discussed above, Aristotle had attempted to make a clear distinction between, on the one hand, imagination and the sense perception, which both use the sensible koine, and which animals also have, and, on the other hand, nous and reason, which perceives another type of koine, the intelligible forms, which only humans have. In other words, these Romans allowed that people could have animal-like shared understandings of reality, not just in terms of memories of sense perceptions, but in terms of the way they would tend to explain things, and in the language they use.